Howdy folks, and welcome back to the channel. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're taking a trip back in time to explore what a full day of eating looked like for the working class 250 years ago. It's not just about the food. It's about the connection to our past and the stories that come with it. When I say the words breakfast, lunch, and dinner, what pops into your mind? You're probably thinking of eggs and bacon for breakfast, a quick sandwich for lunch, and a big meal with the family for dinner. For us today, our eating schedule is often dictated by a 9-to-5 job. But for a working man or woman in the 18th century, it was a completely different story. Their meals were a careful balance of practicality and necessity, fueling them for a full day of hard work from dawn to dusk. A hasty start. Let's start the day with breakfast. What do you think of? For most of us, it's a donut and coffee, eggs, or pancakes. But if we were to travel back to the 18th century, we would find a breakfast that looks nothing like our modern morning meals. The focus was on a simple, hearty meal that was quick to prepare. This is something that resonates with many of you today. As one viewer shared, "It's good to know that as a working woman, my daily breakfast of oatmeal is exactly what they were eating in the 18th century. I love that it is for the same reasons. It's cheap, it's fast, and in the winter, it is nice and warm." Another viewer echoed this, saying, "I literally eat bread and cheese for breakfast most days. Big cup of tea, chunk of bread, and some cheese." This idea of a simple, no-fuss breakfast for busy days is timeless. The core of the 18th century working man's breakfast was oatmeal, or what they called hasty pudding, because it could be made in just a few minutes. It also appeared as milk porridge, or pottage. Historical texts from hospitals and workhouses listed a breakfast of oatmeal thickened with broth or milk and some bread. Even a farmer's breakfast was basic, often a beef broth or milk porridge. A viewer shared a wonderful memory from their grandmother's farm, where the breakfast for the family and farm hands was oatmeal with water and homemade buttermilk. Another viewer remembered their grandfather's breakfast of oatmeal with country ham and red-eye gravy, a simple but filling meal that would carry him until lunch. Even the wealthy often ate simple meals for breakfast. Benjamin Franklin mentioned the classic breakfast of bread, cheese, and beer in his autobiography, and the Duke of Bridgewater had a breakfast of a mess of water gruel. This shows that for many, simple meals were a conscious choice, not just a matter of budget. The midday dinner. After a few hours of hard work, it was time for the day's most important meal. For a working man or woman in the 18th century, lunch was what they called dinner, and it was the main event. It was a substantial, heavy meal to fuel them for the rest of the day. This tradition is still alive in some places. A viewer shared that in parts of the UK, dinner is still the midday meal, with a lighter meal in the evening called tea or supper. A person from Germany shared that lunch is a big, warm meal where everyone comes to the table, and dinner is a colder meal of bread and sausage. Another viewer recalled growing up on a farm in Iowa where the midday meal was also called dinner and was a huge meal of heavy protein and starch. These stories highlight how these traditions have been passed down through generations. The meal itself was often a communal effort, with women cooking for the men working in the fields or on the railroad. The meals were often brought out to the field so the workers didn't have to take a long break. William Ellis, in his 1750 book Country Housewife's Family Companion, wrote that if the men didn't get their food on time, they would lag in their work and lose time in expecting it. This is how important this midday meal was. He lists some examples, like broad beans and bacon one day, and beef with carrots or turnips or cabbage or cucumbers or potatoes another day. These were substantial single-dish meals. A viewer perfectly illustrated this, describing how a yard dog in a rendering facility had a big container of an unreasonable amount of meat or eggs with potatoes, beans, biscuits, or macaroni for lunch. So let's get to cooking the working man's lunch, a pot roast with beef, carrots, and potatoes, inspired by these historical references and your family stories. Here's our pot roast recipe. Prepare the beef. We're going to take a large, inexpensive cut of beef, rub it generously with salt and pepper, As a fun historical touch, one viewer mentioned their family used bacon fat to flavor food, and nutmeg was a common spice back then, so you could add a little of that if you'd like. Sear the meat. Heat some oil in your Dutch oven and sear the beef on all sides until it's a beautiful brown. This creates a flavorful crust that makes all the difference. Add the vegetables. Once the beef is seared, add your sliced carrots and potatoes. A viewer talked about how their family makes a similar meal with turnips, calling it a one-pot wonder that keeps body and soul connected. I couldn't agree more. The liquid and cooking. Add enough water to almost cover the meat. Put the lid on and place it in a modern oven at 350 degrees for an hour or two. For those of you who really want to get into the historical spirit, you could cook it with hot coals both above and below the Dutch oven. The working man's supper. When you hear the word supper, you might think of a big, hearty meal. But for the working man in the 18th century, supper was the opposite of a modern meal. It was a simple, light meal designed to be easily digested, ensuring a good night's sleep for a hard day's work to come. The reason for a light supper was simple. A heavy meal was believed to be hard to digest and would prevent you from getting the rest you needed. Historical texts even warned that the flesh of pigeons is hard to digest and therefore not judged proper supper meat. A viewer perfectly explained this, noting that this belief about melancholy juice highlights how their understanding of health directly influenced their diet. A viewer from Germany explained their modern routine, which echoes this old-world idea. I may eat 2 slices of bread for breakfast with some tea. Lunch should be the main meal for me in an ideal world, and supper is usually just bread again, or some other light meal. This is so similar to the 18th century working man's meal plan. What did a light supper look like? Things like peas pudding, bread and cheese, or simple oatmeal were common. Benjamin Franklin even described a very light supper indeed of half an anchovy on a small strip of bread and butter with half a pint of ale. This shows that the light supper was a conscious choice for many. One of my favorite comments was from a viewer who shared a memory from their aunt's farm in the 1950s. The day was fueled by a huge morning meal and another big meal in the late afternoon. The end-of-the-day meal was generally a slab of pie or cobbler topped with cheese, and it didn't take too long before everyone was upstairs in bed or asleep in their chairs. This is a fantastic example of a sweet and savory and ultimately comforting end to the day. The working man's seafood feast. Now, let's talk about a food that was a staple for everyone, from the richest tables to the poorest homes, seafood. In the early American colonies, the eastern seaboard was lined with cities, and the Atlantic Ocean was our superhighway. Fish was a huge part of the economy and diet for everyone. It's a far cry from how we often see seafood today as an extravagant food. As one viewer commented, the fancy food of today was the working man's food of yesteryear. The working man's life was all about feast or famine. When there was a bounty of fish, they had to think about how to make it last for the whole year. This meant preserving it in many ways, like drying and salting. Salting cod was a very common way to preserve it for months. Potted salmon was another method, where the fish was submerged in clarified butter to seal it off. A coastal twist. A special ingredient that was a staple for many coastal workers is oyster. We're going on a culinary journey back in time to explore a food that was a staple for everyone, from the richest tables to the poorest homes. One viewer shared he grew up in Indiana and Kentucky, far from the ocean, so getting these oysters today was super exciting. This journey has reminded me of a comment from a Noter viewer who said they grew up in Indiana and Kentucky too, and can relate to being a Midwesterner who gets really excited about seafood. It's a special treat. In the 18th century, oysters were so plentiful that they were eaten by everyone. You'd see them in the wealthiest homes and the poorest settings. In some cases, oysters were even considered a survival food. The Chesapeake Bay, for instance, had so many oysters that they were described as being thick as stones, and ships had to be careful of them because they would form walls or like tunnel shapes within the water. Before Europeans even arrived, Native Americans were already eating oysters. There are accounts of them eating so many that when Europeans showed up, They found mounds of shells, or many little mountains of oyster shells that had piled up over the years. As one viewer commented, archaeological digs have found large piles of oyster shells outside of where taverns and coffee houses once were, much like chicken wing bones outside of an Applebee's today. This shows how oysters were a cheap and hearty food, perfect for the working man. A viewer mentioned that when their grandfather came to Jefferson County, he'd walk to the beach and eat them raw. To create a working man's oyster dish, we'll take a cue from the comments and a viewer's suggestion for a hearty one-pot meal. We'll shuck our oysters into a pot, and instead of frying them, we'll boil them in their own liquor with some beer, a little salt, and maybe some bacon bits for flavor. This hearty one-pot meal would have been easy to make and very filling after a long day of work. Boiled lobster tail. People ate lobster all the time back then. A viewer noted, lobster was so plentiful and as a bottom feeder considered a trash food that in Massachusetts, indentured servants got a judgment saying they couldn't be fed lobster more than 3 times a week because it was cruel and unusual punishment. We're going to keep this recipe simple and cheap, just like a working-class family would. Just boil the lobster tail and maybe a little lemon juice to finish. Pan-fried shrimp. A text from an 18th century researcher stated that shrimp are of a sweet and tender flesh, more delicate and wholesome than lobsters or oysters. This is so interesting because today, oysters and lobsters are often at the top of the menu, while shrimp can be seen as pretty lowly. For our shrimp, we'll melt some butter in a pan, toss in the deveined and deshelled shrimp, and cook them until they turn pink on each side. Breaded fried cod. Cod was very important to our early colonies. As one viewer shared, their ancestors who were merchants and fishermen in New England considered cod to be a very big deal. We'll take a cod fillet, dry it off, and dredge it in flour seasoned with salt and pepper. Then, we'll fry it in butter until it's a golden brown on each side and the inside is nice and flaky. As we reflect on these historical mealtime traditions, I'm humbled by the stories you've shared, of big noon dinners on the farm, of grandmothers cooking for a crew of hard-working men, and of simple, nourishing meals that brought families together. These memories remind us that while our modern lives have changed dramatically, the core human needs for community, for nourishment, and for a good story remain timeless. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. I hope this brought back some wonderful memories for you all. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more trips back in time, and let me know in the comments what your family's mealtime traditions were like. See you next time, folks.